Good evening and welcome to the next webinar in the series for the preparation for practice. Before we begin, the Rax and I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise the continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to them and their cultures and to elders both past and present. So if you've been with us from the very first webinar, welcome back. Now that you've set up your financial base and your aims, hired or outsourced your staff and set up your practice, promoted yourselves ethically, legally and broadly, and hopefully began to do some private work, it's now time to reap the rewards of your hard work and start billing for your services. And unfortunately, this is where a lot of the pitfalls are found. Tonight, our webinar is on medical billing. Just firstly, to remind you all to use the chat function to fire in those questions that'll be answered in the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. Any questions we don't get to will be forwarded to the speakers and the responses will be up on our website in the coming days. Lastly, please complete the quick survey at the end of the webinar and remember to re-register for the upcoming webinars. So let's all learn about medical billing. I now introduce Margaret Faux from Synapse Medical Services. Welcome and thank you, Margaret.
Thank you very, very much, Patrick, and thank you to the College of Surgeons for having me. It's a pleasure to be back for the third year in a row. I'm just going to share my screen. We're on quite a tight schedule tonight, just 20 minutes, so I won't waste time and we'll just get going. So I thought I'd just put a lovely picture there on my opening slide, system Nirvana. There you go, you've got a verdant field with beautiful trees and a rainbow and happy patients, happy doctors, happy relatives, happy everyone, and just a river of money flowing under this health system. And I'm going to be the bearer of bad news and just tell you that there is no perfect health system. There is no health system nirvana. That image doesn't exist. But we have a very good health system in Australia, one of the best in the world. And whilst it's creaking a bit after 40 years of existence, it's still not in bad shape. So let's just get started. That's the contents of what I'm going to go through in the next 20 minutes. I've put a couple of, dazzling headlines there for you because we've all got to talk about this. This is 3 years ago when I was first asked to come and talk about the legal, ethical and practical consequences of billing. This was the reason I was asked to do that, because surgeons were in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. There was a lot of media hyperbole about out-of-pocket costs and so forth. And that hasn't really abated that much over the last 3 years. We're still getting a lot of stories about crowdfunding for surgery and so forth. So we're going to talk about money tonight. I'm not going to tell you what to charge. I'm really sorry about that. If you thought I was going to say you should charge this or you should charge that, I can't tell you that and nobody can. I'm going to put some context around the ethics of pricing and give you some guidance and approaches and ways to be thinking about this really important area. And it's really exciting that you actually can get out there now and start charging for all of that hard work. I remember the first time I issued a bill for a service that I provided and thought, wow, they actually paid it. It was amazing. So it's a very exciting time, but pricing is not easy. I'm the CEO and founder of Synapse Medical Services, which is a global company with offices in 3 countries, Sydney, Chennai and Dubai. And I still find pricing hard. We've got 100 people in 3 offices around the country, around the world. We do billing, coding, transcription, education and consulting. I priced a big project today in the Middle East and it was really hard. We did a cost plus model and we had, 10 people involved in the pricing for this particular project because it's for a government agency. So pricing's hard. It's really, really hard to get right. I love what I do. I'm a registered nurse as well and a lawyer, and I love what I do. I've ended up in the health financing space. It was a weird journey. I didn't plan it that way, but my life is codes and money. So we work in the American code system where we use ICD-10, CM and CPTs and all this other stuff. So I love health financing transactions and how we move the money around health systems. Foolishly, some would say about 8 years ago at my age, I embarked on a PhD on Medicare claiming and compliance, would you believe? And I said to Marilyn I was going to be finished before this presentation this year, and I'm not, but I'm so close. I'm only about 2 months away. So I'm just writing up I was on my discussion chapter today and writing up the conclusion on the weekend. I'm moments away from an 8-year journey on Medicare claiming and compliance. And we do have some challenges. It's quite messy in there. The other thing I do, I just started this website a couple of weeks ago, actually. It came out of the COVID pandemic and work I've been doing helping doctors. That's my law firm. So you can now send me a question on anything, any question about medical billing. I will answer it. This is a law firm. This is not Synapse. This is a law firm. So I write as a lawyer, which means you get the protection of my legal indemnity insurance as well. I will protect your privacy. So all the questions are posted anonymously, but publicly, so that everybody can benefit and learn. So let's launch into to shopping for health. Now, in the little abstract of this presentation, you will have read all the things we were going to talk about, but that's the 1 hour version. This is the 20-minute version, so I can't do all of that. So some of it I'm just going to send you to places where you can learn about it if you're interested. So it used to be really fun. I'd always get the colorectal surgeon in the room to sell me a colonoscopy to explain why shopping for health is not the same as shopping for a TV, but obviously we can't do that today. But if you'd like to learn about that, you can jump onto that course and learn about information asymmetry, the moral hazard, the social determinants of health, the realities of rationing, and poor health system literacy. This is all part of my PhD learning, I guess. And these are the reasons why buying health is not the same as buying a TV. Just the one thing to just be very clear about, and you do need to understand it, because as I go through the slides, you'll think, why? If you don't understand this, that the health market is unique, because when we shop for health, we don't shop for the characteristics of that of which we are purchasing. We don't buy a colonoscopy. That's awful. Nobody wants to buy a colonoscopy. What we buy when we buy health is the promise of an outcome, and that outcome is some benefit to our health. Problem is, we don't know whether what we're being sold is actually going to give us that benefit, because there is a power imbalance between us and you. So just that's all you need to know for now. But if you'd like to explore that more, just jump on that course. In terms of the, we're going to go now to the history and legal foundations of Medicare. Again, I'm not going to read from that slide. This will all be made available to you later so you can read it for yourselves. But essentially, the only thing you need to know that's very important is that you have a constitutional right, no less, ladies and gentlemen, a constitutional right to charge whatever you want. It is in section 5123A of the Australian Constitution, and in many ways it's the starting point of my doctorate. So I'm not going to go into the hows, whys, and how on earth did that happen, but it is such a privilege. There is no country in the world that has a similar provision. That's why co-payments don't work in this country, so don't set me off on that path. That's why co-payments do work in other countries but can't work in Australia, because they can never be controlled. So it's quite a complex area of law, but it's a great privilege, but of course it comes with great responsibility. So a couple of things you do need to know, because I've seen people trip up on it. When I say that, they think, yay, I can charge whatever I want in any circumstances. You can't. There are restrictions, right? So that constitutional provision doesn't mean you can charge whatever you want in any circumstances. There are certain circumstances where you absolutely cannot because of other arrangements. So one is when you're bulk billing. It is illegal to charge any other amount of money at all. And the other is when you are bound by the terms of a contract. The most common example being when you work in a public hospital. You've signed an employment contract, you are employed by the public hospital. If you are a salaried medical officer, you can, or actually and a VMO too, any type of contract in a public hospital, it is illegal to charge any amount of money to a public inpatient, public admitted patient. So they're just two examples, common examples, where you contract out of that constitutional right. The other thing to know is the MBS is not the law. I just say that always because, again, I'm examining this and having a lot of detail in my PhD. The MBS and the law don't always match. The MBS is a departmental interpretation of the law. The law sits below it. It is an interpretation you would do well to adopt, but just be mindful of the fact that the MBS is not always clear, I guess, and is sometimes inconsistent. So let's just go to a bit of law around fees now. I'm always surprised when I do this talk and I say, you know about the code of conduct, right? And everyone just, goes, no. So when you register as a practitioner, you sign up to the code of conduct. It's under the Health Practitioner National Law and it is administered by APRA. So there is the Good Medical Practice Code of Conduct. It's on the APRA website and it has various areas of the code there that I'm just highlighting for you where it talks about fees and charges and the financial relationship that you have with your patients and your responsibilities there. So you have legal responsibilities in relation to your disclosure of fees and the information you give patients about fees. The law actually spurns the whole concept of caveat emptor when it comes to the medical profession because your patients are seen as exceptionally vulnerable. Again, this goes back to that initial comment I made, is that we don't know what we're purchasing from you, right? When we buy a car, we know what we're buying and we've got consumer law to protect us. We don't know whether we need it and we don't know whether it's going to give us the outcome. So we are rendered vulnerable. So basically, the law sees that as you being a fiduciary, that it's not an arm's length transaction. And what that basically means is that whole concept of buyer beware, caveat emptor is buyer beware. It doesn't apply to you. It does not apply to doctors. So then the other area of law that's very important for you is the ACCC. I would encourage you to jump on that website. I've got the link there for you at the bottom of the page. The ACCC's got excellent information about fee setting for medical professionals and your legal obligations in regard to informed financial consent, in regard to not having not engaging in misleading or deceptive conduct, and not sort of skating around the realities of fees and outcomes and so forth. So jump on there because it's really helpful information. So we're 10 minutes in and we've got 10 to go. So I wanted to just focus a little more because this is the stuff that I think will really be beneficial to you. So when the talk is about the ethics and law and the consequences of pricing. So let's just look at the ethics of pricing. So when is pricing ethical? It's really hard to find information about the ethics of pricing, can I tell you? And look, as a businesswoman, I've read books on pricing and pricing strategies. Everyone in business does that, and you're in business, so you need to be thinking about that too. There's not a lot written out there on the ethics of pricing. Maybe that's just because they're all business books. But this is a beautiful little table that I found on one of the many pricing books I read over the years called The Strategy and Tactics of Pricing. There's a chapter dedicated to the ethics. So if you look at that level of ethics there, level 1 is where the price is paid voluntary and the implication is buyer beware. So that's caveat emptor. So that represents a completely free market where information is equal between the buyer and the seller. The next level up is where the price is paid voluntary and it's based on equal information. So that's no sales without full disclosure. So, you can't hide car defects and risks of smoking and things like that. We now have modern consumer law that protects people against things like used car defects. But that's sort of the next level up of when pricing is ethical. It was voluntary. All information was given. The next level up is, in addition, it does not exploit buyers' essential needs. And that's really where the medical profession sits. Because the implications are there should be no excessive profits on essentials such as life-saving medicine. And a classic example of that, a present example of that, is price gouging in relation to PPE. You would have all read about that, right? So there were a few egregious businesses who started price gouging and trying to sell their PPE for outrageous prices. And the ACCC actually enacted Australia's first anti-price gouging law, just for COVID to stop them doing it, saying you cannot charge that for a mask or PPE. The next level up is that all of those things apply and it is justified by the costs. And the implications are that you don't segment your pricing or have excessive profits based on shortages. So really what you're talking about there is things like postcode pricing. So you're charging for the same thing and you're charging it different amounts, doubling the price for rich people, that sort of thing. That is where you sit on this ethical table. And then the final level 5 to say the exchange is ethical when it provides equal access to goods regardless of one's ability to cover cost, and no exchange for personal gain, give as able and receive as needed. Now, in my view, that's sort of akin to communism. And I think that's probably incompatible with modern life because you're not even allowed to cover your costs there. But I think that helps you just to think about what is ethical pricing and where do you want to sit on that table. So if you look now at approaches to pricing, and again, I'm not going to tell you what to charge. I'm just going to get you to think about it. We all have to ask ourselves in life, how much is enough? When is it enough? So no one can answer that for you. You all have to answer that for yourselves. But think about a few things. The first thing is to understand the AMA and the MBS schedules. Now, no one's looked at this in more detail than me because up in the starting point of my PhD, I had to go right back to the beginning and say, how was Medicare built? What happened? How did we get this initial schedule in 1975? What was going on? And basically, the AMA was involved in that process because the government was going to put together a schedule of fees and went to the AMA and said, would you mind getting on board and telling us basically, what do you guys do and how much do you charge for it? So the AMA came up with this thing called the list of the most common fees, and they just put this schedule together. It was based on nothing, ladies and gentlemen. That's the problem with it. It's no one's fault. It's just a historical fact. It was basically a bunch of doctors, probably guys, and I would expect back in 1975, standing around a barbecue saying, what do you charge when you take an appendix out? $100? Yeah, no, I charge 80. Call it 90? Great. There you go. Appendix, $90. And that's basically how the first schedule of fees was built. I kid you not. What that means is there is no science. There is no science behind those fees that ended up being the MBS fees and have ended up being fees over time. Now, in terms of indexing, what the AMA fee list therefore represents is sort of a longitudinal study, if you like, of what fees would have been had they continued to be indexed against certain indices over 40 years. But the starting point was flawed. No one's fault. The starting point is flawed. And certainly some fees should have continued to go up, but some should have dropped by half. Things like cataract surgery. You know, I remember nursing cataract patients and how complex and difficult that operation was, and the patients were in for 10 days and it was a 2-hour operation, and it was, you know, intensive nursing and log rolls. And I remember I was a nurse, I did it. And now I code cataract operations and they take 10 minutes. So you can't justify constant increases when technology has made those changes. So they're complex issues, but just know that those schedules don't really represent true cost or price. You do have to know your costs. There's a lot of pricing strategies. You do need to get financial advice. Think about what other professionals charge. Be mindful of the fact that the Australian Tax Office puts out the highest income earners in the country every year, and that's you. You're right at the top, and you've worked hard for it, and you deserve it. But you are there. You are right at the top. The government's relative value study, I always put in this presentation because I think it offers a really good approach to think about what your costs are. It was a 10-year body of work that the government did that was shelved. But you've got the link there, and it's incredibly detailed formulas to work out what your costs are. So you might want to use that perhaps to just work out what your costs are. Some people say to me, you know, what should I charge? And I say, listen, I don't know what you should charge, but don't charge it if you wouldn't be comfortable anybody seeing it. And I've had doctors come to me and say, oh, she put it on Facebook. I can't believe it. And I thought, are you kidding me? In this day and age, don't charge it if you wouldn't be comfortable it being on Facebook. Don't. Someone will put it there. So make sure you can justify it and you're comfortable with it. And then you're okay. And I'd say, please don't do it just because everybody else does it. I see that a lot. Everybody else charges it. You know, your high-level individuals, professionals, think for yourself. And it's actually illegal to price fix. You should all know that. So the ACCC makes price fixing illegal. So it's illegal to all agree to charge the same price in a practice. Now, GPs have a specific exemption for that in certain settings, but specialists do not. So that's actually price fixing and it's illegal. So you have to think about what you want to charge individually. Now, the impact of out-of-pocket costs today and into the future. Look, we are in a difficult period of the evolution of our health system. Not sure yet where it's going to go. But there's some graphs on there for you. Australians in 2017-18 spent over $30 billion on out-of-pocket medical costs. That was mostly specialists. In fact, it was mostly surgeons. And that's out of about, I think it's 160 billion total in health. But it's a lot, and it just keeps going up and up and up. And at the same time, the number of Australians that have private health insurance coverage is dropping. So in the last quarter, it dropped for the first time in, I don't know how long, I think it might be decades, but it's dropped below 44%. It's the lowest I have ever seen it. You might have, if you follow this discourse, and I certainly do, Stephen Duckett and the Grattan Institute writes a lot about this, and he's described private health insurance as being in a death spiral. And some say that's a bit dramatic, but he is able to justify it. But certainly to have private health insurance coverage dropping to below 44% to 43.8% in the March quarter is very, very troubling. So I guess, you know, at some point, and at the beginning of my PhD, if you'd said to me, we'll have a referendum and we'll get that section out of the Constitution, I would have said never, that will never happen, because we've had 44 referendums since Federation, only 8 have been successful. That is not going to happen. 8 years later, I actually think at some point that might happen and it might succeed, because I think Australians are getting to the point where they're thinking, I pay my taxes, I pay my private health insurance, and then when I have surgery, I have to pay another $10,000. I don't know if I want to keep doing this. I want to be operated on the public system. But, you know, what I can say is that, again, it's in the conclusion of my PhD, is that it is up to doctors. It's actually in your hands. It's incredible, actually. Because of this constitutional provision, Australian doctors actually control the money. Now, I know what the private hospitals are doing. I know what's going on. They're trying everything they can to control you in private hospitals, and that will break at some point as well. That's not going well, and I know a lot of you know that, and patients don't like it either. So we're all trying to get control of spending, and it's not going so well at the moment. But we can fix it. I want to end on a happy note and tell you that I've got a lot of recommendations for reform that'll benefit everyone. And I'm not suggesting we have a referendum. That's just a no-go zone. I think that's a waste of everybody's time and money. But you do have to remember that no other market can turn on a tap. I don't have business care. Sometimes I wish I did. I wish, you know, when things didn't go well, I wish I could just put in a claim and say, can you give me some money because I didn't get that client. It is a very unique and privileged position to be in. And so it comes with great responsibility. So good luck out there. I hope that was helpful. And I hope it gives you just some context and some ideas about how to approach this very important part of your work. And there's all my contact details there on the slides. Thanks very much, everyone.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thanks so much, Margaret. That was extremely informative. We'll get the 2 questions at the end of the whole night. No, very, very interesting. Now, okay, we move on quickly to our next speaker, who is Michael Law from RACS, with a practical interactive on medical billing, how we should or shouldn't bill. Right, so thank you, Michael.
Right, thank you, Patrick. So this is an honour for me to be involved in the preparation for practice course again. It's been a few years since I've been on the faculty, so it's good to be back. So today I'm giving a little talk on interactive billing through a few examples to demonstrate a few of the do's and don'ts of billing practices. So Margaret has certainly emphasized a few of the points about the principles of how the Medicare system came about and some of the principles of how prices should be set. So we're going to put some of those things into practice with all the current Medicare schedules and private insurance schedules as well. So this is the group I work with, this mob, and this is my rooms at Mitcham. We are based at the eastern suburb of Melbourne, for those who don't know where Mitcham is. So when we do any billings, of course, there are a few reasons why we might want to bill. So the first one is this beautiful surgery that we might want to own or in the process of decorating one day. It looks like a plastic surgeon's room to me. And we have to pay for our staff, of course. Or the next holiday we might be dreaming about. We certainly would be dreaming about holidays for a little while now that we're back in lockdown. And Victorians all got the plagues, haven't we? And we've got to pay our taxes, our accountants, and of course that dream house that we always wanted. And maybe the private school fee that might be. So let's talk about the basics of billings here. And let's talk about the Medicare system and how the health fund interacts with Medicare. And then we move on to understanding how the out-of-pocket cost actually works, the one that Margaret mentioned, how we've got a control over. And then how we're going to get about getting paid, actually getting money in the bank, and a few little tips that we learned along the way of what to do and what not to do. So let's start off with how the system actually works. So you provided the medical service, you consulted on someone or you operated on someone. So the sources of payment where you get your actual money from, first of all, is Medicare. If they're privately insured patient, then you might get some from the health fund and some the patient would contribute. The proportion of that depending on when you are dealing with a public patient, where most of that would come from Medicare, or an insured patient, where you may get a mix of both Medicare and the health fund contributing, or you may get a self-funded patient where the patient entirely contributes with or without a little bit of Medicare contribution. So in order for a patient to access Medicare and for you to get paid through Medicare, there are a few criteria you need to fulfill. The first one is you've got to be an eligible practitioner. So all of us, hopefully in this seminar tonight, would have got our letters. So we got our specialist recognition. And in certain circumstances, when you're billing, for example, for a radiological procedures, there may be also other additional requirements, such as getting what we call a location-specific provider number before you can actually bill certain groups of item numbers, such as those used for ultrasounds. And I'll give you an example a little bit later. You also need to have eligible services covered by Medicare. Now, what are eligible services? I think you guys might be all familiar with that really big book that used to sort of bench around a theater tea room that everyone, all the bosses all look up. So these days, that book is obviously an app and is also online through Medicare Online. You can look up item numbers and all the restrictions and conditions. But services that are not covered by the MBS booklets generally are not eligible services. And a good example of that would be, for example, cosmetic procedures. Now, there are some procedures which, when performed, under certain indications, are Medicare eligible services, such as if you do a breast reduction for symptomatic macromastia or musculoskeletal pains, that's a Medicare covered services. But if that same breast reduction is done, for example, as a purely cosmetic procedure with no medical indication, again, that is not covered by Medicare. And each of those things would have a specific descriptor on the book about what is eligible and what is not eligible. And you also need an eligible patient. So you need basically someone who's got a valid Medicare number, as well as a valid referral. Now, I think in other talks through the webinars, we would have seen that referrals required generally is a 12-month referral from a GP. Specialist referrals are only good for 3 months, and GPs can also issue indefinite referrals. And of course, you've got to send through the right paperwork to Medicare in order for us to get paid. And some patients obviously are not necessarily paid by Medicare. Veteran Affairs may pay some of the DVA patients, and that's a special category. Now, Medicare stipulates that under the Health Insurance Act, you are solely responsible as the billing practitioner. If you allow your provider number to be used for billing, you are solely responsible for that. So therefore, if anyone in your practice makes a mistake in your billing, it's still your responsibility to repay the debt. Now, where it matters, I think for a lot of us, is we all use staff, and obviously they can make mistake, and that's fine. But sometimes we do get audited, and we may have to pay some money back, and we may have to substantiate our claims. But what's more worrying is you work in the public sector. Some clinics, for example, are billed under Medicare, and the hospital uses your number to bill. I think you've got to be mindful that you're also responsible for repaying some of those money if the hospital accidentally bills incorrectly. So there's something just to bear in mind when you sign up to those MBS clinics in public outpatient. So the general payment formula is the schedule fee is what the government recommends you charge. Now, as Margaret already mentioned, that schedule fee started off from a historical point and has been adjusted to certain indices throughout the years, but as you all know, for the last few years has been frozen and it's only been recently re-indexed. So that certainly hasn't kept pace with the inflation throughout the 40 years that Medicare has been in action. What the rebate is what Medicare actually pays you. For most things, you're looking at about 85% of the scheduled fee, and that's what you actually get when you bulk bill a patient. And for certain inpatient services, you're only looking at about 75% of the scheduled fee. Now, I think that implies, if you look at that, because Medicare's schedule fee obviously has a difference between what Medicare actually pays you, it already implies that Medicare does suggest that there should be a gap between what you actually charge and what Medicare is prepared to pay you. Now, the size of that gap obviously is what we've talked about previously as well, something that we need to determine. And some of that is dictated also by the health fund, as you will see in the next couple of slides. So this is just an example of the online MBS page where you can jump onto, and the web page is on, the link is on top, as you can see. And this is what one of the procedures I commonly use look like. So the book obviously has the item number, and next to that, a little information icon tells you what restrictions and groups this might belong to. So this description here is called a descriptor, and that basically gives you an idea of what the procedure relates to and when you're allowed to use the item. This tells you that a multiple procedure rules apply. So if you do another procedure together with this one, you have to follow the multiple procedure rules, which we'll explain again in the next slide. Then it tells you whether there is a fee for the anesthetist and also for the assistant associated with this procedure. Now, you got to make sure that your provider number is eligible to bill for this certain group. If you're a maxillofacial surgeon, for example, you have fallen under a different group to a general surgeon or a plastic surgeon. So let's look at this through a little example here. So I've got Mrs. Jean Smith. She went to an initial consult for a thyroid nodule and a bit of breast soreness, for which she had some breast imaging for. So as part of the workup, you decided to perform an ultrasound of 2 of the nodules and a unilateral breast ultrasound in the office, since you are trained as an ultrasound as to do surgeon perform ultrasound. These are the numbers you put through to your secretaries. So you're all familiar with the item numbers, I trust. So 104 is for the initial surgical consultation. And then this item number is for an ultrasound in association with a surgical procedure. So you only bill that once because you understand that doesn't matter how many nodules you use a guided biopsy for, you can only use that item number once. That's what the scripture says. Then you've got this item number here, which is for breast ultrasound. Now, this here is called non-referred. So for those who do medical imaging in their office, non-referred refers to a scan which is performed without a referral to you to specifically perform the imaging. So you may get a referral from the GP to work up this lump, but it doesn't imply that you are expected to do an ultrasound. So this is what we call a self-determined ultrasound scan, in which case you get an NR. It attracts far less fees than the referred one, but in order for you to use a referred one, you actually need to have a specific imaging request to say that you want that the GP wanted you to perform an ultrasound, and you're obliged then to issue a detailed report where you have no obligation to do that if you have a self-determined scan, although you should make a medical record of your findings. Then you've done 2 biopsies here, all right, for the FNA for the nodules. Now, this is how the breakdown actually works if you look at the maths. The 104, according to the schedule, is $88. 85% gives you a rebate of $75.01. The ultrasound in relation to the biopsy normally fetches you 109, and 85% of that is 92. However, there are certain rules which govern some of these things. For example, under diagnostic imaging rule, for the consultation associated with an imaging, you have to take $35 off the fees. And then if you do an ultrasound for the breast, there's a second rule that applies in this scenario because this is a second scan that you've done for the patient. There's a $5 reduction in association with a second ultrasound. Then you have to apply for the 2 biopsies a multiple procedure rule where the second item is only billed at 50%. Now, just to run through the multiple procedure rule, the first item that you charge under that group is billed at 100%, which you would get $163 for example, in this example. Second item only gets 50%, and third and subsequent items attracts only 25%, okay? So the maths will work out $75 plus $74, which is after the $35 reduction, $23 after the $5 been taken off, and then $163, second item is 50% of that, which is only $96, and gives you $418. So if you don't or forget to apply some of these rules, you end up with several $100s more, and the patient won't get a lot of that back, and they will be not very happy patient with a big gap. All right, moving on to a second example. Here's one where there is a billing error. So you perform an excision of a lipoma in the patient's back in the private hospital. He was on warfarin. After the operation, he developed a hematoma, and you decided to drain in the rooms in the first post-operative review. So you bill these following item numbers. Now, can you bill after an operation, a 105? The answer is, in most cases, no. There are a few exceptions to that rule. If you see an item number, if you see a procedure where it says exclude aftercare in the descriptor, then you're actually allowed to charge 105 at the post-operative review. And a common example of that will be drainage of an abscess. However, in most operative procedures, a 105 is not allowed to be charged in the first post-operative visit. However, because you've done something else that's different, you are eligible therefore to charge for that number, which is the aspiration of the hematoma. Now, so in this case, I'll just illustrating that point, you actually drain the abscess or the hematoma on this occasion where it specifically says exclude aftercare. So you bill the 105, and that's perfectly valid, because in this case, it specifically said you're allowed to do that because it excludes aftercare in the item descriptor for the operation. Now, another example, you perform a breast cancer operation on Mrs. Smith, and you billed her for a wide local excision and a sentinel lymph node biopsy. She returned for her first post-operative appointment, and you checked her wound briefly, then proceeded to discuss the pathology and the adjuvant therapy, including chemotherapy and radiation. You spent a substantial amount of time doing that. You billed her 105. Would that be allowed in this scenario? Providing a documentation is good, to substantiate that the most of your consultation has nothing to do with the post-op follow-up. You actually are allowed to do that, although you must specify in your billing that this is not a routine post-operative consult. Otherwise, you would get a rejection from Medicare. All right, now moving on. This is a very common problem that we see all the time in the rooms, and this is one of the more common reasons that you see a claim rejection. So you perform a bilateral temporal artery biopsy in a private hospital. This patient was billed this item number, temporal artery biopsy, by 2. The claim was rejected because it is a duplicate number. The reason for the rejection in this case, there you go, thank you, Simon. So the reason for that in that case is because there are 2 of the same item numbers are billed, and the computer automatically picks it up and says duplicate, and it will reject your claim. But if you submit the claim with the left and right clearly marked, then you won't get your claim rejected. So make sure that when your secretary submit the claim, make sure that there's a clear label as to, for example, the site, a different site of the same procedure, same item numbers. All right, let's look at another example. You're a general surgeon and you perform a cervical lymph node biopsy. The billing item number is this one, lymph node biopsy of the neck. The claim was rejected. Now, Simon again. The reason why this claim was rejected, despite the fact that you got the right descriptor, is because 52025 is a maxillofacial group number. Even though it's got the same descriptor, a general surgeon is not eligible to use that group. Correct item number should have been 31420. So make sure that you have the right eligibility to bill the item number under a certain group, craft group. Now, the next one, there are a few tips. So make sure that you read the descriptor and explanatory notes carefully and look for the exclusions and inclusions and what things are associated with the aftercare. Make sure that you do not bill 105 on the day of the surgery. Even though you might have had a consult in the morning and then you see the patient for surgery in the afternoon, that often would result in a rejection, and you may need to resubmit the claim with the clear differences in time. For example, 9 o'clock in the morning and then a 4 o'clock emergency operation in the afternoon. Otherwise, you will get a rejection. Referral must be valid on the day of the consultation, and you cannot backdate. The referral is only valid for the course of the treatment for which the patient was referred. So, for example, if a patient was referred for treatment of a breast lump, and the patient goes, "Can you have a look at the skin mole for me?" Well, that's not part of the referral. You technically are not allowed to bill for that extra lesion that you looked at for the skin mole. And don't forget to apply the multiple procedure rules, whether it be a multiple procedure rules for procedures or for imaging. All right, moving on. How the covers actually applies to inpatients and how we look at the gaps and 100% MBS services. So the billing from a health fund basically consists of the following. You have the hospital bed fees, add the theatre fees, add the surgeon's fees, and the anaesthetics fees, and the assistant fees, and then there are miscellaneous for the patient, including pathology, radiology, pharmacy, and all the miscellaneous modern conveniences at hospitals. If you're quoting for a self-funded patient, the breakdown of the fees would consist of basically these things. So what do the health fund actually really pay, considering that they are charging a fair bit of premium for the patients these days? So do they pay for the bed fees? Absolutely. But the hospital got to be eligible hospital for that particular health fund. If you send a patient to a hospital which has not got an agreement with the health fund, they may not be eligible to be paid for that fees. Same applies for the operating room fees. Just for a rough guide, an hour in the operating room is roughly around about $1,000 for most private hospitals. And of course, some of the surgeon's fees it will be paid for, and that depends on the amount of gap that you decide to charge. Then we're moving on to the anaesthetics fees, and same applies. Some anaesthetists do charge gaps and some don't. And say similar things apply for the assistant. And some covers would cover you for pathology and radiology at certain hospitals. Some would cover some drugs. Some funds would even pay for your free internet and free TV in the hospitals. And again, some don't. So what is the gap? A gap that you quote the patient is basically the fees that you charge, less the MBS rebate, and the mandatory health fund top up, which is up to 100%. So under John Howard, he brought in a rule that all health funds need to top the patient up to 100% of the MBS fees, but they are not obliged to pay any more about that. But most health fund schedules, if you charge within the gap or no gap schedules, would allow a health fund loading to apply. And that brings us to the next point, which is Medigap cover scheme. Now, you can sign up to be a known gap provider or a no gap provider. Or you can choose not to participate in the schemes at all. So if you're a no gap provider, you have committed yourself basically to the health fund to say for that particular fund, patient members of that particular fund, you basically have no gaps for that. You charge no gap for that patient. If you're a known gap provider, then you have committed yourself to charge within the recommended gap for that particular health fund. And some put the ceiling on up to $500, $800, but you can't charge above that. Otherwise, the patient would lose that extra health fund loading. Or you can simply select not to participate in any of these schemes, and therefore the patient would only be topped up to 100% of the MBS fees, and whatever the difference is, that's the gap. Now, let's look at a few examples looking at the health fund. You perform a lipoma excision and you're on an insured patient in a private hospital. So the billing item number, again, is 31345. So the MBS 75%, $160. The health fund would top you up to $214 for an insured patient. Now, this particular health fund pays $404 for this procedure under the no gap scheme. So Medicare pays $160. The health fund tops up $244 to make up the $404, and the patient pays no gap if you decide to charge no gap under this scheme. However, if you are a no gap provider, but you decide to charge a gap, and you bump your fees up to $500, which is above what the health fund would charge, the health fund loading would be lost in this scenario. So again, Medicare covers $160. The health fund top up is only $53, up to 100% MBS. The patient now lands at $285 gap. Notice that your fee difference is less than $100, but to the patients, is over $280 worth of difference. Another example, different health fund pays this amount, same amount for the same procedure under the no gap scheme, but the fund also allows a maximum gap of $500 to be charged under the known gap scheme, which you choose to participate in. Your fee for this procedure is $900. Again, looking at the MBS rebate, $160. Health fund top up is $244 up to the $400 mark, and you charge a gap of $500 for the patient. Now, in this example, if you suddenly decide to charge $1,000 for it, noting that last time you only charged $904, but if you bump it up $100 or so to $1,000, again, the patient suddenly lose that loading and the gap becomes $785, a substantial difference to the patient. Now, not that anyone's going to charge $1,000 for lipoma, I hope. All right, moving on, let's try to do a simple quote in another example. You got this item number for mastectomy and a skin lesion excision at the same time. You got a fund which allows a maximum gap of $500. This is an example of what a quote would look like. You have the fund paying just over $1,200 for these item numbers, and then your multiple procedure rules applies. You get a 50% discount, 25% discount for the third procedure. You charge a gap to $500. You come up with a quote of $2,200. So I'll leave that up for a minute for everyone to have a look at the numbers. Make sure that you're clear in your head how the multiple procedure rules and the gap works. So there are a few pitfalls in billing for private health fund. You've got to make sure that the patient is covered. There are a lot of junk covers out there. I had a patient who are only covered for 3 procedures, 2 of which he's actually not covered for. One is a hysterectomy, for which he's a male. So that obviously wouldn't apply in that scenario. You also need to make sure that the condition is not a pre-existing one, because again, if you've got a pre-existing condition, for most funds, there is a waiting period of 12 months before they would cover for that procedure. So this is the waiting period. Is it necessary to get the health fund approval? So there are some plastic procedure, for example, which are pre-approval from the health fund, and one of the main offenders would be Medibank and Bupa, who sometimes ask for pre-approval before they would let certain procedures to make sure that they are the proper Medicare indications. All right, and there are variations of schedules between health funds as well. Some health funds got more than 2 schedules. You've got to make sure you pick the right one when you do a quote. So let's look at what a true out-of-pocket cost for the patient is. When you go into hospital bed fees, most policies have an excess. So some patients have 0 excess, some patients up to $500 excess. That's one of these fees that the patient have to pay for the first claim of the year. Now, again, the year, some funds starts at the financial year, some funds starts at calendar year. So the timing of the surgery, depending on what funds the cut-off dates are, may have a significant impact on the patient, whether they pay an excess again for their particular claim. Operating theatre fees, that's fully covered by most funds. Surgeons' fees, up to a gap, is covered. Again, there's a gap for some anaesthetics fees, assistant fees, and then miscellaneous may or may not be paid at all. So these are some of the hidden fees which you need to warn patients about when they come in as your private patient when you do a quote. Some of the hidden charges can be quite large, and they may include radiology, pathology, particularly if the private hospital does not have an agreement with the fund when the service provider in that particular hospital has not got an agreement for a no-gap service of radiology and pathology. There are also some consumables which are non-rebatable, and hospitals may pass on that charge to the patient. For example, a fancy new device for hemostasis. In days gone by, even a ligature was not rebatable, but most of the time the hospital does absorb those costs, although sometimes they don't. So internet TV, again, it's something that you need to pay for. But drugs is another big complaint for the patients. A lot of the time, patients go, why am I going to pay another $30 for my 5 tablets of endone? So that's something you might need to explain to the patient beforehand, that pharmacies may charge extra money. Again, that depends on funds, and it also depends on whether patients have reached the Medicare safety net for medications. Some funds provide district nurse services, some funds don't. Again, a common example would be like Medibank, one of the big funds that actually don't provide district nurse or hospital home services. In which case, if you do need a draining attended to or dressing be done, patient may have to pay per visit for that to happen. So these are just some of the common hidden charges you might find.
Now, Michael, I'm mindful of time.
Yep.
We could talk about this for the entire 12 sessions.
Absolutely.
I reckon this is so detailed. But is there any other specific vital information you want to add?
Yep. So just very quickly to wrap up, just about how to get paid. So there are a few ways to do it. You can either use your practice management software to calculate all those complex quotes and things for you. And most like Genie and, Clinical Cloud and things with the built-in modules for that. You can also get paid on the spot through your FPOS machine, and some got HiCap, which is a online claiming system built in. Again, that's just quick money in the bank. So make sure that you make some investments in those electronic systems to make sure that you do get paid quickly. I think that's some of the more important things. Just very quickly, stick to the rules, be conservative compared to your peer, and make sure that you obtain informed financial consent and keep a good record, and also have a good experienced staff to help you with the billing with good software. I can have the slides afterwards, and that's my last one. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you so much, Michael. I like your segue to, go get the IT help, get the billing staff help. That goes all the way to Margaret. Back to Margaret again.
Exactly.
Go
right.
to SM, the synapse. There you go. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank both Margaret and Michael for the great talk. Like as I say, we can go on for days about billing. It may seem so simple and trivial, but if you don't get it right, you're just going to get a bad reputation as well as not get paid. So get help and ask for help, ask for assistance. Like I said before, we're surgeons. We got no idea how to do all this stuff. Please ask, right? So now I want to, before we go to questions, I want to bring in my co-convener, Ms. Marilyn Raj, who is a urologist with nearly 10 years of experience in both the public and private practices, so that she can share some of her experiences with billing from a surgeon's perspective. Thanks, Margaret. Margaret. Thanks, Marilyn.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Look, I'd like to echo what both Michael and Margaret have said, and that is that as surgeons, we actually know little about the intricacies of medical billing. And I think it is really important to get the appropriate advice. Just like if you were going to invest in something, with your earnings, you would seek out the appropriate advisors. And I think this is, no exception. The reasons to do that are sometimes your own colleagues won't actually understand the nuances of the billings. A lot of them will relegate that because it's sort of the too hard basket to their admin staff. What you've got to realise is if you're going to relegate that responsibility to someone else, that doesn't mean that the accountability is removed from you as the practicing individual. And I think that's where I'd urge you to, get in contact with people like Margaret and her Synapse medical site, where they can actually offer you advice about the legalities as well as what the what the appropriate way is to go about things. The other thing is that I found it personally very strange that a lot of my colleagues didn't actually want to talk about what they charged. And in fact, I was actually quite surprised by that. But it's not uncommon that people want to be very private about that sort of thing. And so it makes it extremely difficult when you're starting out in private practice, because you go to people who you consider are your mentors, trying to get valuable information, and you sort of come away with your tail between your legs thinking, well, I didn't really learn anything from there. So don't get disheartened. Go and seek the right professional advice. And the third thing is, if you don't understand something, don't pretend that you can, click a few buttons on your medical practice software and that it will magically all work out in terms of the numbers at the end, because that's probably the easiest way to get the billing wrong. So, either get someone to come and train your staff. I did that, and it was probably the best few days in terms of actually educating them and avoiding problems in the future. You will find that there are constantly things that are changing, particularly now with COVID and telehealth becoming, a bigger part of our consultations than it ever was in the past. All the logistics that govern how you can bill for telehealth. I learned a lot from actually reading Margaret's updates throughout the first 3 months of, COVID lockdown, and actually was a massive education for me. And I sort of thought that, I had most of my head around the billing, but it's a minefield out there. So get the right advice is my advice.
Yeah, that's right.
You read them. But, can I just jump in? A lot of people said the same thing. A lot of doctors, many with many years, decades of experience, gave me lovely feedback during that time, saying, I felt like I got an education in medical billing. I just didn't. I just learned all this stuff about how Medicare and medical billing work. So anyway, I'm glad that was really valuable.
Well, thank you for that, Margaret. But it's a moving goalpost, though, isn't it? That's the problem we have at the moment. It's every single month something's different. So if you're just we're simple surgeons, okay? We don't know all this stuff. So please ask for help. And if you ask for enough help, you won't get yourself into trouble. The worst thing is, you get into a rut, you go down this spiral, and you get audited, and it's a disaster. So please ask them.
Yeah, or bill things that your colleagues don't. It's really risky to do what everybody else does. I'm not talking about fee setting now. I'm talking about rules of billing. Can you bill this with this? Are you allowed to do that? Can my specialty bill this? And I've seen a lot of practitioners get in all sorts of trouble because they've adopted a billing practice that was wrong, sometimes for years, and then it all came undone when Medicare came knocking.
Just a big question about that, Margaret. Are there checks and balances that stops that from happening?
Not really. No? And it's something I've written a lot about in my thesis, because the problem is in the qualitative interviews that I did with the doctors in the second half of my PhD. So I interviewed two groups, GPs and salaried medical officers working in public hospitals. So that's relevant to you because they were both proceduralists and non-proceduralists. And I just, asked them everything about billing. And a lot of them said, it was really common, a lot of them equated payment with compliance. Really common, right? They'd say these sort of throwaway comments, things like, well, they're paying me, so it must be right. Right? And that is just, that's just completely incorrect. And that is a real flaw in Medicare system, and they need to smarten up, because there's a recent case of a poor GP who went to Medicare and said, can I bill these items, ultrasound item numbers? And he's a phlebotomist, he was doing really good services. There was no question about his sort of the quality of him or his services or what he was doing in remote part of Tasmania. Contacted Medicare, said, can I bill these ultrasounds? I'm going to buy a machine based on what you tell me because, you know, this is what I do. And someone at Medicare said, yep, you can claim those 2 item numbers. So I went and bought an ultrasound machine. He recorded the telephone conversation. He wrote a letter to Medicare after that telephone conversation confirming the contents of the telephone conversation, just confirming that my understanding of what you've told me is that I can claim these item numbers. So he set off, claimed them for 5 years. After 5 years, Medicare came knocking and said, you can't claim those item numbers. You've never been able to claim them. You have to pay back $350,000 to the government. So that case is just speaks volumes about where we are and the problems with the system on so many levels that hopefully my work and the work of others will help to address. But for now, for all of you, you just have to get on with it. You've got to practice and bill and get paid for your work and do your best. But I guess it's a cautionary tale not to just, you know, adopt the blind leading the blind. Make sure the people who are giving you advice really know what they're talking about.
All right, so we got the most questions we've had so far, all right? So can we get both Michael and Margaret to answer some of these?
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, we've got, okay, all right. Now, first of all, question to Michael. So why does there appear to be problems in submitting claims with more than 14 items through Eclipse to Medicare?
So that is actually a software issue. It's not to do with the Medicare not being able to handle it. But to be honest, 14 item numbers, that's quite a lot for one case.
Yes,
and I remember
I
those are 25% items, so I'm not sure that's really worth your while anyway after that.
Yeah, 25% of $50 each time
Yeah,
is not a lot.
exactly right.
Okay, so
it is a software issue that they can't handle because they don't expect people to have 14 item numbers. I think
that's right. Actually, Eclipse only we've got our own software, so we've built our own Eclipse software, and it's actually in the development set. The maximum number of lines on an Eclipse claim is 14.
Yeah. Oh, that's it, is it? Oh, wow.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's,
I thought there was a change.
Manual claim.
Yeah, I thought there was a change towards less item numbers. Isn't it? Are we moving towards something like 4 or less or something like that?
Not on Eclipse. No, Eclipse has got 14. Yeah.
Okay, we've got another question. This one to all panelists. How do we find out what procedures need pre-approval? Is there a list on the insurer's website?
Though the answer generally is no, there isn't actually a list, but the common ones that they often have problems with are the plastic reconstructive procedures. So we frequently encountered with several health funds where they request that the indication be submitted quite clearly, what those procedures are done for. Breast reduction in my area is probably one of the key ones. Then you have to actually write in and say, yes, it is for a medical indication, it is not a cosmetic procedure. And the historical thing that underlies this procedure is basically that, there have been, surgeons in the past who would take out a skin lesion and admit a patient for that, and then do a breast augment together with it and claim the hospital stay. The health fund then subsequently wise up to the fact that, oh, hang on a minute, you are admitting the patient for a 5 minutes SCC, and you are doing a breast augment and using the admission. So they started to prorata that, knowing that's a good component of that is actually a not covered procedure, but they're paying for the admission anyway. So that's the history behind that.
I don't think we'll get to all these questions, but anything that's coming in, if we can't get to it, we'll forward to Margaret and Michael down the track. Now, another question here for both guest speakers. In the current COVID environment, where patients are requesting telehealth consultations, do we have an obligation, legal or ethical, to bulk bill consultation? And B, do we have to offer telehealth, or can we only offer face-to-face consultations?
Okay, so a few parts to that question. So the first part is no, you don't have to bulk bill anymore. For those of you who were on that blog of mine, Marilyn and others, you would have seen some chaos. You have to bulk bill, you don't have to bulk bill, you have to bulk bill vulnerable people, then you don't. It was really wild ride there for a couple of weeks. But specialists do not have to bulk bill now. That you do not have to. Poor GPs, your GP colleagues, for a certain group of patients, vulnerable patients, still do, but you don't, so you don't have to worry about that. There is no legal obligation on you to offer telehealth, right? So, but this is actually part of a slightly more complex question that I'm going to just suggest that you might want to chat to your medical defence organisation about it. There's some really good resources on their websites too, because that doesn't sort of mean you can turn a patient away as well, because there's other legal ramifications in relation to your obligations to your patients. But from a billing perspective, so put negligence and other things aside, just billing, no, you don't have to offer telehealth. Some practices are choosing not to. And you can offer face-to-face, but if your patient doesn't want to come in for a face-to-face, then I guess I'll go somewhere else. Telehealth.
Yeah. I think the issue, though, there are a few practical issues with that. One is you must obtain financial consent beforehand. So that is a difficult thing to do over the telephone or over video consult. Secondly, is obtaining the payment is another practical thing, because, at the end of the day, they're not at your office. And we all know that if you don't get payment on the day, your recovery rate is significantly lower.
Correct. You should be getting informed financial consent for all patients anyway, not just inpatients. And I think that is an area that is, again, a bit of a trap, because a lot of people talk about informed financial consent purely in the context of surgery and, big, inpatient episodes. Informed financial consent is every single time you see a patient anywhere, you have to tell them what they're going to be paying. So when they come to your rooms, whether you're doing a telehealth consult, it doesn't matter. You have to work out how you are going to tell them what it's going to cost. And I can tell you, because I am doing a bit of work with the department at the moment around all this telehealth stuff, and I can tell you that they are already getting complaints about telehealth from patients who were saying, I thought it was going to be bulk billed. Nobody told me I was going to have to pay until the end of the consult. So that's already happening. And, that is just, like telehealth's under the microscope at the moment, and everybody wants to keep it. But it's really incumbent upon the profession to demonstrate high levels of professionalism and respect for the privilege of having these new telehealth item numbers, getting your informed financial consent, making sure you're using the right item numbers, all of that.
I'm going to get a couple more questions only. But by the way, there's a few comments here that they would all love to read your PhD thesis once it's done, Margaret. They would please put it on your site. Thank you very much. Okay, so a couple more questions. We've got a rural specialist. Work in rural regional area, and we are only 4 surgeons in the town. Since I've just started, should I just charge the same as other surgeons? And any other tips about paying assistants for item numbers which do not attract assistant fees? To both of you.
Michael, you want to take this one?
Yeah, so I think the fees that you charge in relation to that first part, whether regional surgeon charge differently to city surgeon, I think that's your choice. You've got to look at your cost basis. It may be more expensive for you to hire staff over in the country, but they may be cheaper, rooms and real estate. So look, it's a lot of factors. It's a business after all. So you do need to set your fees according to what's viable for the business, but also within what your peers do charge. But I think as far as paying assistance for those item numbers go, there are different practices in place. You either don't use an assistant for those procedures, which is what we do. So we tell them to turn up a little bit later, or you can have an agreement and say, look, you can still get a percentage of what I do. Some of your regular assistant might be kind enough to say, look, you know what, I'm here anyway, I'll just give you a hand for free. So that's actually most of mine. They usually volunteer to stay, but that you got to have a pretty good relationship with them.
So choose your assistants well.
Absolutely.
That's it. Choose anything
Never
well.
mind.
Yeah. Okay. So another question from the audience. Do you have any recommendations for billing training? It says,
I do.
Yeah.
Billing training jumps straight on the AMAC website. I put my PhD, my brain courses. Because there's only one of me and everybody wants billing training. So I've done it in these bite-sized bits and they're really cheap and I'm very proud of them. And you know, there's one on bulk billing, there's one on, let me just think, the rules of referrals, provider number, law and practice, and I sort of wrap the law around it, but try and keep it simple. But they're going really well. They're selling really well, and the feedback's really great. They are the only online billing courses in the country.
So the link to that is on your website, correct?
Yeah. If you go to our website, you can get to everything.
Yeah. Because I think we got the link to your website on our website. So just navigate through that. Yeah. Okay, I might go with the last question. It's about item 105, probably to Michael. How long after procedure can you claim a 105?
It depends on procedures.
Is it different? Is it different depending on procedure, biopsy versus operation? And does it depend on if there is a complication?
Yes. So the 105, basically, it always says a post-op period is defined as what is reasonable for that procedure. So you need to ask your colleagues, basically, you got to do something similar to what everyone does. Like a little skin lesion may well be a week to 2 weeks. A hernia might be 6 weeks. So different procedures, but a reasonable period varies, but it needs to be something that is acceptable to most of your peers in that craft group. Now, there are, what was the second part of the question?
It says, is it different depending on different procedures? Does it depend on if there's a complication?
Now, complication, it's different. Now, you can bill for the complication of fixing the complication. For example, if the patient has pneumonia, you're dealing with the pneumonia, not dealing with the actual top thing, then yes, that consult may well be eligible for 105, but you need to specify that quite clearly that is different to a direct post-operative complication. For example, my example that, I'm counseling my breast cancer patient on post-operative or on neoadjuvant or on adjuvant therapy, that's different to the post-op for the breast lump excision. Again, that may be eligible, but it needs to have a very detailed description of why it is different and clearly flag that it is not a routine post-op visit. Mm-hmm. And even that, you may expect a little bit of a hurdle for Medicare.
Thank you once again to both of you. And there's more questions. So expect in your email lots of questions from us, okay? Now, thank you once again. Very enjoyable talk by both of you. And now just some final words. To all the attendees, can you please keep sending your questions in, either via email to us, and we'll forward it to Margaret and Michael, and the answers will come up on our site. Now, thank you for attending, and just a reminder to fill in the survey at the end of the webinar and register for the next webinars. Next week, we've got 2 days, Tuesday and a Wednesday. The Tuesday webinar at 7 o'clock is very interesting. It's working with TAC and work cover. Interesting indeed. Legal contracts, and very apt at the moment, bullying and harassment in the workplace. Yeah, it's no good to have all this set up if your staff is not happy and you're doing bad things. So it's very topical, very useful for your ongoing practices. So looking forward to virtually seeing everyone next week. Thank you and have a good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a good evening.